Hello, welcome to the Idea of a Man podcast. My name is Omar Zach Phillips from theideaofaman.com, and I'm so glad you're joining me for this, the first of the Idea of a Man podcast. Today we don't have any guests, it's just me, so we're going to be talking and discussing the idea of a man, and the first question is going to be the question, who am I? Not me specifically, but you're asking that question to yourself, or I'm asking that question to you. Who do you say that you are? What is your take on yourself? What is your I am within your own your own world, your own life, your own kingdom. Why that question is so important here at the Idea of a Man is because that's what it's all about. Us as individual men asking and answering the question, what is our idea of a man? So glad to have you here. Glad to have you here joining us for the Idea of a Man podcast. And we're going to get into it in a few moments. Make yourselves comfortable. Whatever's going on in your world, just put that aside and start thinking about manhood. Your masculinity or lack thereof, whatever the case may be, or however you feel about your masculinity at the moment. Let your mind kind of just begin to go there. There's so much pressure on us as individual men to perform, in a sense. There's a lot of talk about the reality that as men we place pressure, and society places the pressure upon women, and there's no doubt about that as well. But that's not the subject or the content of the idea of a man, because here we're dealing with men's issues, so that we can reflect and represent better as men on the earth, as ourselves from an authentic, genuine place. I'm not here to preach or to beat you over the head and say, this is the idea of a man, this is how it should be lived out. That's entirely not the approach of the idea of a man, for several reasons. One is because reality is, you have a truth that's true to you. You have a reality that's true to you. Some of the best sort of counseling kind of modalities really have been from like the unconditional positive regard, have been the ones that have kind of asked you, the client, as it were, or me, the client, asked us questions and enabled us to ask and interrogate ourselves for the truth that comes intrinsically from our own souls. And when we dig into that, and then we begin to allow those answers to just kind of come out of us, there's such a deeper truth that is able to be expressed, and we don't have to then sort of, as it were, comport ourselves into anybody else's ideology, and that's really important. So let's look at a couple of things and look at why that in itself is important. I think that's so important because, okay, I could go through the different parts of my journey, although I'll probably kind of splatter most of my content with aspects of my journey, so I don't want to necessarily talk too much about myself straight away. We'll just talk about the ideas and the general concepts. One of the things that I've observed in kind of the journey of a man's life, and I've certainly had this reflected in my own life in its own area, but it seems as if society kind of sets up soul traps, things along the way which we can get ourselves caught up in, which want to kind of dictate to us what kind of a man we're supposed to be, or what masculinity or manhood is. And oftentimes we're looking for those answers, and so there kind of comes these institutions, organizations, these forums, these places which have a ready answer for us, okay? And that's specifically why the idea of a man isn't going to come with a ready answer. It's going to come with tools, it's going to come with information, it's going to come with help, but it isn't going to come with a ready answer. It's not going to come and say to you, this is the idea of a man, walk ye in it. It's going to come and say, what is your idea of a man? And it's going to encourage you to kind of do that internal questioning for yourself, because without you interrogating your own intelligence, without you interrogating your own the depths of your own psyche, the conclusions that you come to, you could live out for years and then eventually be looking back and like, oh damn, this wasn't even my life. This is somebody else's concept or idea of a man. This is somebody else's idea of how I should live my life on the earth. And that's a shame. That's a tragedy when you kind of come to those conclusions, especially when you've expended energy and time and effort in trying to be whatever kind of man it was that you thought like life required of you. And as life unfolds for me, I'm discovering more and more that all life requires of me is that I bring myself to the table, my most authentic, genuine, real self. The more I do that, the more life makes sense, and the less I do that, the more I feel compelled to present something else, some other, some other aspect of myself, or some other, act really, in accordance with what people outside of myself are requiring of me. The more I live like that, the more unfulfilled I am. The less of the reality of myself I'm able to give, and so therefore what people get is like a diluted, watered down version, something else, something contrary, something that really doesn't align with my truth. And that can be a problem on so many different levels. How do we avoid that? How do we avoid that trap? Well, I think the key there is discovering for ourselves really who we are. The Oracle of Delphi was asked by Socrates, for the key to wisdom, and she essentially said, man, know thyself. And I think that that's just pertinent, when you think about that on a level, man, know thyself, and it's not easy. Like the whole journey of self-discovery, people talk about it all the time. I need to go and find myself and whatever. It's not as simple as it sounds. Like, well, just look in the mirror, right? Or just know yourself, just know your truth. It's not as simple as that. That's the reason why why we have those kind of statements in popular vernacular. I need to find myself or whatever, because there comes a time in our life when we realize that the life we're living isn't reflective of anything that really comes from within us. Perhaps we're living contrary to our values. Perhaps we feel pushed into my wife has described it as feeling like as if she's been pushed into a bottle. She's trying to be contained, like, life and people, and perhaps even me as her husband is trying to contain her, and there comes a time in our lives where that containing isn't going to contain us anymore. We don't want to live from that place anymore. We want to live from our truth. We want to live from a place of authenticity. We want to know who we are so we can live that truth in our lives, in our relationships, in our day-by-day existence, in our work, in the way that we show up in the world, and that person that we reflect out to the world. How do we touch that point? How do we get there? So obviously we could use all the tools. We're living in the information age. On the internet, there are personality tests you can do to get to the bottom of like your personality. You could ascertain like your star sign. You could look at, when were you born, the time, the date, the star you were born under, etc., the moon you were born under, the sun you were born under, and you can get a chart, you can get a reading. And all these things are valid. All these things are ways in which that might really help to get to the bottom of it. But I think another thing though is just looking at our own experience, like taking out the time to really perhaps journal a little bit, perhaps write your thoughts down, perhaps begin to track your dreams. Sometimes just begin to really ask some genuine questions, and it can be scary, depending on your life path, depending on the things that you've done so far, and depending on how much you have been like caused to comport yourself into other people's ideologies of what is right for you. So for example, if like you're raised in a particular religion, for example, if your parents had a specific vocation that was kind of right for you according to them, if, say, for example, you find yourself in a group of friends, a group of peers that have a particular way of conducting themselves and living, but now there's, say, something has happened in life, and it's just causing there to be a slight question mark. Say you were a rowdy bunch of friends, and you all go out drinking, you all get up to some stupidity on a regular basis, and then you land yourself, say, in prison or something. That could be a moment whereby you stop and say, hold up, is this the life I really want to live? Like, is this going to continue for forever? Is this making sense? Do I want to continue down this road? It might not be as drastic as that. What's deep about life is sometimes the things we get caught up in that really don't reflect anything to do with our truth are stuff that's really socially acceptable, and perhaps that's the key. It's the social acceptability of life that seems so safe, so kind of just fine, and everything's dandy. But reality is, it's not our truth, and it's not like you necessarily, although you might need to go on a kind of a big bender of a kind of rebellion. But there's a real need perhaps within ourselves to say, okay, this might be a really socially acceptable vocation way to conduct my affairs, way to live my life. But in fact, something within me is longing for a deeper expression of truth. Something within me wants to know more about who I actually am, you know. And I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. If you do much research on about the world, about history, about life, about origins, about where we all come from, it kind of gets a bit deep. Of recent years and recent time, began to go a little bit deeper in terms of trying to get to the bottom of what it's all about. And I don't know what questions and answers you're getting with regards to these things, but I remember when because I was raised as Christian in a Christian religion, but then as I got older, I moved away from that, and then I began to learn about like the Sumerian gods and those kind of things to do with sort of the Anunnaki. Now, when I initially came across those ideas, it was kind of a bit novel because obviously having been brought up with the Adam and Eve story. Okay, wait a minute, no, it wasn't this God who started it all off. Might have been these guys who kind of spliced us and did these genetic experiments, these aliens, and that's why we're all here. And maybe that's why we're all kind of stuck in these 9 to 5s, because we're all, having to pay our taxes because we are the slave species of the gods, and we're having to give our, our energy and our resources to the powers that be, to the system, so they can get gold for their planet or something. Now, who knows, right? Who knows? Some of my conclusions have gone deeper than that since. But I remember when I first came across that type of material, and not to in any way, shape, or form negate that in and of itself, but it made me question, it made me look at the world, it made me look at life, it made me look at the way I work and the way I do things, and maybe ask the question, because sometimes you just feel like you're a wage slave, like you have to do this to fit in society, to pay your bills, to keep a roof over your head, to do the basics of life. But how much self-expression, how much artistic expression, how much creative expression is able to get access through our lives? How much are we able to know ourselves as unique individuals? I know for me, again, and I mentioned just now that obviously I came out of religion after I'd been raised in a particular kind of religious point of view. That was a soul trap that I had to ask deeper questions and get deeper answers about, and come to my own conclusions with regards to, so that I could know myself better and know what was right and true for me. And this is so key and important, imperative for us as unique men on the planet, to ask the relevant questions for ourselves that help us to get to the bottom of what's actually true for us. And some families might find that really difficult. I remember my daughter had a boyfriend, and he was deeply Catholic, and that Catholic constraint had a huge impact upon his life and upon the decisions and choices he had to make when finding his own identity. I think about a lot of Muslims that I've known, and how that kind of family dynamic can be so strong that that's such a part of your identity. And then I began to kind of learn more about sovereignty and about this reality, especially when I began to learn more about my own psychology and about the archetypes and about the king sovereign, the king archetype, which is your sovereign archetype, and the need to kind of know yourself as a unique individual without apology or justification. And one of the revelations that I got was that all these titles we put upon ourselves, Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hebrew, all these titles we put on ourselves, man, boy, girl, all these titles we put upon ourselves, even our name, is something we've put upon ourselves. Actually, it doesn't define the unique soul that exists within us. You look at me, and I'm talking here, and you see a head. Now, inside that head is a brain, and inside this chest is a heart that pumps my blood. Now, the truth be told, those things are organs that keep this physical body operating in the physical 3D dimension, but they're not my mind or the heart we talk about when we talk about, say, falling in love. That's the brain, right? Now, the brain is like a portal within the physical dimension, which taps into the mind in a dimension which actually transcends the physical dimension. The heart, which pumps the blood, sure, there's emotions and nerve endings that go through us, but the reality, although there is chemicals involved and there's physical things involved, we know this because when you're messing with things like hormones and stuff, or if, say, a person was suffering from some psychosis, they might give them a drug and change up the chemical composition of the person so as to kind of sedate them or bring some kind of calmness to their lives. But the reality is, who you actually are, what's actually going on within yourself, transcends the chemical makeup of you, transcends the physical organs that make up your body. And we know this on so many different levels. It's been, thought about and philosophized about and argued about for forever. But let's suffice to say, without kind of having to create a doctrine around it, that there's a bit more to life than simply the five senses. That's why we talk about the sixth sense. There's a bit more to life than just the physical dimension. There is the spiritual dimension. There is spirituality. It's a reality of our lives and our existence. We exist, and somehow within the human being, there's a longing for some connection to something spiritual, something more transcendent, something a bit more. And, we all have to kind of come to our own conclusions with regards to what that's all about for us. But that in itself, for me, causes me, as a person who I define myself with, that I have a level of spirituality, to want to seek some kind of spiritual answers. I can't just suffice myself with answers which I feel come from a place of fear. When people are kind of like too afraid and more like, I need a scientific answer because I need things to make sense. Sure, all right, if that works for you, but you're not explaining and breaking down the dimensions of existence that exist beyond the physical. So unless we're going to go there and go into the kind of scientific aspects of things, and a lot of people do, there are some great people, philosophers, and some people who go very, very scientific with it into the realms of these things. And I love listening to people who have that kind of level of intelligence too. And hopefully we'll get some of those kind of people on our podcast to discuss some of those kind of ideas and where we can go with that. That should be very exciting, particularly in how it relates to men and our journey on the earth. But I think I'm saying all this simply to say, that part of us, that deeper aspect, that aspect really that we could define as our personality, that aspect of ourselves that perhaps we kind of we get to know as as what projects out of us. Even as I'm talking, you're becoming aware of the personality of this peculiar guy who's having this conversation with us here about masculinity and manhood and who am I and whatever else. And as I talk and as I convey and express myself, you're getting a bit more of a feel for me. Now, if the words that come out my mouth and the way that they were comported and expressed were completely different, I might look exactly the same, but clearly it would be a different personality that was talking through me. You're interacting with the person that I am based upon the life that I live, the DNA that I've got, the genes that have compiled together over the centuries and millennia to bring me about to this particular point in my life. Now here, sitting at 47 years old, having had the experiences that I've had, this is the me that you get. So there's a lot that's gone into that reality, just like the same with yourself. Whoever you are, wherever you are, things have contributed to where you currently find yourself. And kind of getting to the bottom of that for yourself, asking and answering that question for yourself, knowing that for yourself, so that you can say, that wouldn't work for me. That's not true for me. Say that the Jehovah's Witnesses come knocking at your door tomorrow, or you bump into a Mormon in the street, or somebody else wants to kind of throw some ideology down your throat and express that this would be a good perhaps course of action for you. Well, you can then examine and explore it. Like, how does this tie in with my value system? Because you've done the work to ascertain what your value system is for yourself. This is why I think it's so important for us to come to conclusions with regards to what our idea of a man is, to know ourselves on a deep level, like what works for us, what is our truth, what makes sense. It really comes into play in our interpersonal relationships. When you have an intimate relationship with another person, when you know yourself, when you know what's right and true for you, then you're able to give that reality to that other person. And there's going to be times when that might come under compromise, when that other person might want you to be different, because something about you might be annoying, something about you might not sit well with them. And sometimes that's okay. And sometimes we can adjust and adapt. Some level of flexibility is good. But there's also got to be a line whereby we begin to realize that, if I change this about myself, if I try to just sort of hide or tuck this aspect of myself away because it pleases you, then you're not going to get the authentic me. And what's going to happen is either I'm going to start to lie and live a disingenuous life, a life that really is not reflective of my truth, which can create all sorts of problems in relationship because, when eventually it comes out to the fore, it's like, damn, I didn't know that about you, and then, that can create a whole lot of problems. And we'll probably talk about that more and how that can work out in our lives as men and the shame that that can carry, depending upon the nature of the things we, as it were, to use the words of Robert Bly again, like put into the shadow bag. And that's where a lot of what we do here at The Idea of a Man and talk about here at The Idea of a Man is going to come into play, because we're going to deal with some shadow work. As men, we need to sometimes do what's classified as our shadow work. Shadow work is when you realize that because of how we are expected to show up, initially from our parents, really, initially from our upbringing, from our brothers or sisters, the world in which we're living in, the society which we're living in. I was walking along with my gorgeous wife the other day, and, some kid, a young kid, I don't know how old he was, 11, whatever, 12, shouted out on his scooter that he was going on just after he passed us, shouted out, nigger, and, it was offensive and it was annoying, and, I shouted back, fuck you, what I'm saying? But the truth be told, he got that from somewhere in his upbringing. He had been, taught that was the way to respond to seeing people of color coming past you. And obviously that's a totally unacceptable way to exist, but that's how people carry on, And so the reality of the situation is that as he goes on in life, it may be that he learns that that's not going to bode well for him, and maybe that he realizes that there's something else inside, that he doesn't have to live from that space, that actually that's bullshit, or not. What I'm saying? There's going to be so many human beings who don't ever come to any meaningful conclusions, and they just pass on the same bullshit to the next and the next and the next person, and that's how it goes. But sometimes we realize that the true essences of the beauty of our humanity and the loveliness of who we are as people has been thwarted by a whole upbringing system, a whole culture that we've grown up in, which actually is rooted back in some kind of trauma, rooted back in some nonsense, rooted back in something that we perhaps no longer need to subscribe to. And so making those kind of decisions comes from that place of doing the work to get to know ourselves, getting to love ourselves. Because when you know yourself for who you are, and then you accept yourself for who you are and say, you know what, I'm perhaps not like Frank over there, or Tom or Bob, but I am who I am. And you know what? I don't need to be like Frank, Tom, or Bob, but I can be me. Then you accept and you love yourself for who you are. And then you have also a starting basis from which you can then start the work of investing in yourself. So many of us are looking for some like external investment, whether we say we're trying to start a business, whether we want to be a superstar, whether we want to be whatever it is we want to do in life. Is like, you know what? Help me to be a better man, help me to grow, help me to mature. And so oftentimes we look outside of ourselves for things that actually we could start at least the work doing for ourselves. And in fact, we make ourselves a lot more investable when we do the initial work to invest in ourselves, the things that we need to do to grow and to expand ourselves and expand our consciousness to become more of what's possible for us. But by discovering what is possible for us, or by discovering who we are initially, then we can begin to expand the possible for us. Again, this is what the idea of a man is all about. Because if we can know ourselves, if we can know what our idea of a man is, if we can know what's in our potential, what we want to grow into, what we want to evolve beyond our current status to, then we've got a starting basis. We've got a place from which we can begin to build. But without that self-knowledge, without having done the initial work to get to know ourselves as a unique individual, then really we could be building a whole thing and then all of a sudden realize, you know what, we need to start from the beginning again because we didn't do the initial work to find out who we are. So in a nutshell, this is the idea of a man, and my name is Omar Zach Phillips, and I just want to encourage you as an individual man to start off your work with asking and answering the question, who are you? What's your truth? What's your value system? What makes sense to you? What is the way in which you currently show up? What is the way in which you want to show up? What would reflect your values? What would reflect what matters to you, really, like not based upon any external stimuli, anything that kind of, is imposed, but actually what resonates. When you really look at the things in your life, whether it be the kind of music you listen to, the culture to which you subscribe to, the shows you watch, the books you read, the art you look at, the things that have meaning to you, do they have meaning to you? Do they actually resonate with your soul? Do they reflect something that's important and intrinsic to who you are? Or do you just engage and interact with these things, eat these kinds of foods, dress in these kind of particular clothes because they have been, you've been acculturated to that particular way of living? Or is there more that's possible for you? Or is there something else that in fact would resonate deeper, would flow more intrinsically to your soul's truth, and would make you more passionate about life and living? Because essentially the reason why this is all important, let's get to the nitty-gritty of it, because as men, if you think about, of late, people talk about mental health, people talking about all these kind of things. A reason why we wrestle with so much mental health is because we're carrying so much baggage. We're spending so much energy and time trying to be so many things for so many different reasons, and many of them have nothing to do with us. So you go to work and you have to just be this kind of person. You head down the pub after work for that break, for that nice little beer, just to kind of put everything back together, and heck, you're trying to comport yourself into what the guys down the pub need you to be. And then you go home, and then the missus needs you to be this other kind of person, so you try and fit into that. And then you need to be a good dad, and you need to be a good this, and a good that, and a good third thing. And after you spend all your energy trying to be all the things that you feel that everybody outside of you is trying to tell you to be, you've got no energy left for life, and you feel stressed, you feel emotionally discombobulated, and your mental health is starting to suffer. Whereas if you threw that all out and said, wait a minute, what is my truth? What is my reality? What reflects for me? And you were able to show up at work, down the pub, in the house, wherever it is that you find yourself, as a more clear and clean, authentic version of you, because you own your sovereign right to exist without apology or justification. And I'm not saying necessarily, that's up to you, that you have to kind of be brazen and rude or objectionable. But I'm saying being more authentic, being more true, being more real, being more centered in something that you have done the work to discover. Actually, this is what I like. Actually, this is what I love. Actually, this is how I want to live and exist on the planet. These are the things that I value. Perhaps these are the kind of friends I want to hang around with. And if I can't find the group of friends that align with my truth, then perhaps I'm going to do without friends for a little bit, just so that I can actually become my own friend for a bit, get to know myself, get to relax in the reality of my own company, and begin to explore the things that actually make you tick. Begin to get to know yourself better. Begin to have a relationship with yourself. That key in itself will change so many of our interpersonal relationships and interactions. That in itself will enable you to give the essence of your truth and the essence of your true self in your intimate relationships, in your friendships, in the interactions you have with your family members and things. So many of us just need somebody else to release from the need to conform. So many people just need the permission. And sometimes just live in the example of that by going on that journey for yourself. Give somebody else the permission, and all of a sudden you begin to find that the people around you are living a whole different way. And it might just be you who could be the kingpin to start that ball rolling, because perhaps you hear this podcast, perhaps you just got what I'm saying, perhaps it just clicked for you. That'd be a powerful experience. And I'm going to relay very quickly, and then I'm going to let this podcast just disseminate into the next one, why that was so important for me. So I discovered shadow work probably about 4 years ago. And I'd heard the concept before, but I hadn't really done the work until about 4 years ago. And up until that point, I've been married for 30 years. I've raised 4 children, and I got married very young. I'm a 47-year-old man now. I was married at 19. So those are things that I'm exceedingly proud of. I'm very grateful for that reality, and something I would call myself is a family man. I love the fact that I love family. I'm a one-woman man. I wanted to find a woman to fall in love with and to give myself to. And I did that from a very young age. I found the woman of my dreams, and I'm still in love with her with all my heart and with all my being right now. But the reality is, because of a lot of decisions that I made, and because of a lot of things that I put into shadow, and that process started very, very early on in my life, started off growing up in a very religious household, and my parents had very strict wheres and wherefores for how I should live my life. And so therefore, a lot of my truth got buried. A lot of my truth got shoved into, as it were, shadow bags. And I didn't live from that space. I lived in order to please them. And I became a people pleaser. And then as I grew up, there came a time, actually, as I was kind of going through, coming to the end of my high school education, where there's a lot of question about, what do you want to do next? What do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do for a career? And I got kind of honest, and I really, I did, for my GCSEs, I did like double art. I did 2 GCSEs in art. And when I finished that, I went on to study like fashion and photography and a bunch of different things I was really interested in. And that was exciting, and that was good because I'd come to some conclusions about what I like. I knew I loved hip-hop music. I knew I loved certain kinds of art. I was doing kind of various forms of graffiti. I was doing various forms of art. And I was writing rhymes. I was doing, I was just doing loads of things that were just exuding from within myself, and that expressed how I like to express myself in the world. I was dressed in my baggy jeans. I was dressed in a particular, way. I had my hair on a particular style. I was growing my dreads at the time, and they're all gone now, as you can see. And so I kind of come to a real solid awareness of myself. At the time, I think I had a couple of earrings in. I think I had a nose ring at the time. I was expressing myself. I was looking forward to getting some tattoos. But then I came across religion in my adulthood, as it were, at 18 years old. And the truth be told, I'd been raised that way, but I was kind of just, I wasn't too serious about it all. It was just, yeah, sure, I'm a Christian, I guess, But then at 18 years old, I got serious about it, and I went to church, because I found a church that had some of those things. They had music concerts and stuff, so it kind of seemed like a vibrant place. And then as I got deeper into it, over the years that rolled on from there, I began to ditch all the stuff that was kind of related to me and my music and my art and my creativity, and began to try to comport myself more and more and more into becoming a man of God, and to becoming a preacher, and to becoming all those kind of things. And so as life went on, it was many years later that I began to really look at my life and realize that I wasn't fulfilled, and I wasn't happy, and I wasn't living meaningfully, and that the truth of me was buried beneath something. And I went a very long process of beginning to ask questions about my purpose. I remember books coming out, even in the realm of Christianity, about things that kind of, this guy called Miles Monroe, who writes books about purpose. And I was listening to anybody who kind of was talking about those types of things and trying to ascertain for myself, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Who am I? What am I up to? Long story short, eventually, the spiritual connection that I have, as it were, to spirit, to source, to the creator, to God, to the great mother, to the divine, began to lead me in a direction that took me well out of religion and church and everything related to that altogether, which was so powerful and beautiful for me. And I can't even put into words the joy that I feel in my soul, having realized that was a soul trap. And I'll explain more about perhaps what that is. Maybe we'll do a whole podcast just on the concept of soul trap. It's a big thing. But having realized that wasn't my truth, that in fact it didn't line up with my values, that my values were counter-distinct to that. Having lived my life for such a long time, given my energy, my effort, my time, resources and money and things into that particular construct, into that ideological perspective, into that way of living, I came out the other side of that, having lived a life whereby the reality of my personality been trying to push itself through for many, many years. And in fact, it showed up in addictions, it showed up in behaviors, it showed up in things that really kind of set me back, that affected my relationship to my wife adversely, affected my relationship to my children adversely, affected my relationship to myself adversely. And truth be told, I had a very poor relationship with myself. The reason why, like we're saying, I didn't know myself. I wasn't being true to myself. I had not done the work to be honest with myself about what was right and true for me. And I was living according to all the coulda, woulda, shouldas, all the external obligations required to be a good guy, to be a nice guy, to be a righteous man, to be a church man, to be whatever all that's about. So in the self-discovery, in the work looking and really understanding and coming to terms with myself, transformation was able to happen in my life. Healing was able to happen, and able to look back at my childhood and realize, okay, some of the reasons why this has been so important for me to show up according to everybody else's needs and wants and whatever comes from stuff in childhood where I didn't feel adequate enough. I didn't feel, good enough, maybe because I was picked on at school, or because my parents, were very strict around their religious sort of perspectives, or various other things that happened and occurred. So I had to go back and heal some of those wounds, and that was deep work. That was work that my wife and I spent a lot of time on. My beautiful wife helped me to account around some things, but also we talked in depth, and she helped to pinpoint in my life, and there's another conversation we'll perhaps have on another podcast. She helped pinpoint in my life specific areas where wounds had occurred in my life, and how perhaps I just put a plaster over that wound. In fact, it required a bandage. And so as a result, that gaping wound was not addressed. I love one of my favorite authors at the moment is James Hollis, in his books that talk about the second half of life. And I love the analogy he gives in one of his books specifically on that subject, that talks about the memories unmade bed. And he's essentially talking about unresolved issues, the stuff that's left behind that we haven't addressed. We got out of bed this morning and you didn't pull the blanket over, you just left it so. And then you come at night and you see your bed and you're like, do I even want to get in there? But if you just laid out your bed nice and tidy, you come there in the night at night and you look at that bed, it's like it's welcoming, it's warm, it's inviting. And our lives can have that level of transformation in it when we deal with the issues that are unresolved in our lives. And I reflect on my parents' lives, I reflect on so many older people's lives, and I realize there's so much that is unresolved. There's so much that's never been addressed, there's never been tackled on a psychological level, never been healed, that perhaps there's still a little plaster over the top of some gaping wound, some wound that accrued in childhood or in some earlier stage in our life, in our relationships, in whatever happened. And until we address that and say, you know what, I need to heal, this hurts, this has affected me, until we actually look at ourselves and see how it's affecting us, how that need for acceptance, that need for love, that need for whatever it is perhaps disproportionate in the way it's expressing itself. For me, it was disproportionate in the way that I was, say, pursuing the need for gratification in the sexual area. So I found myself addicted to pornography, things of that kind. Those kind of things affected me adversely, made me less than I'm capable of being. So when I was able to heal the wound beneath that, the cause, then the effect was able to change, and I became free from that addiction. I came into a place where that wasn't an issue for me anymore. I was able to show up in my marriage and in my relationship as a whole man, as a clean man, clean in thought and word and deed. And that was transformative. Religion didn't do that for me, but healing the wounds did that for me. So where I'd been preached to and where I deeply believed that Jesus could save me from all that stuff, in fact, being in the context and the construct of religion impounded those issues. But taking responsibility for myself as a man, taking my responsibility for myself as an individual, brought about healing and transformation and change. Bringing myself to account and recognizing that I had wounds that needed to be addressed brought back transformation in my life. And this is what motivates, and this is the engine behind the idea of a man. I'm not here to try to preach a doctrine. I'm here simply to talk to meaningful people who have come across meaningful answers in their life and who are prepared or willing to share them, so that we can actually get some answers out here that make a change, that make a difference, that enable us to live more meaningful, more fulfilled, more brilliant lives, and more healed and wholesome lives. And so that's what the idea of a man is all about. And I encourage you strongly, start asking that question of yourself and take your time with it. This is not a marathon. This is not a race. This is not something that you have to, there's no prizes at the end of this apart from a deeper integrated awareness of who you are for yourself. So take your time. It's there's no pressure here. Allow that question mark just to simmer in the depth of your subconscious. Maybe take it to bed at night when you go to dream and say to yourself, I would like to have a deeper understanding of who I am. and let the answers come as they come. And as you wake up in the morning, perhaps some answers are going to come, and perhaps deeper insight to yourself is going to begin to unfold in your life. Allow that to happen. Allow that process just to unfold little by little, and be sensitive with yourself, be loving to yourself, be caring to yourself. You are the only self that you have, and you're precious and you're important. And I'm going to constantly reiterate here at The Idea of a Man that you, as a unique individual, are a precious individual. It doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter where you've been, doesn't matter what's happened up to this point. When you start seeing yourself from a different angle, you start loving yourself and investing in yourself, things can begin to really change for you, and they'll change massively also for the people that you interact with, because you won't be a people-pleasing person who's simply out there to just, be at the beck and call of others, but in fact you're going to be a meaningful person who can meaningfully impact others in a meaningful way, because the gifts that you intrinsically have and are capable of giving are so precious, so meaningful, and so powerful, but they can't even be tapped into as long as you're living your whole life and expending all of your energy in doing things just because you are supposed to. When you start doing things because it's your truth, because it's from the depth of who you really are, everything changes. The whole game changes at that point, and all of a sudden we begin to get the authentic version of yourself, and that's a powerful, powerful person to encounter. So thank you so much for spending these moments with me here at The Idea of a Man. It's been such a privilege and such a joy to talk about this conversation, about my truth and my journey of discovering for myself who I am, and I hope that you begin to go on that journey for yourself also. So we'll have another conversation again very soon, but till then, have an amazing life, and we'll speak soon. Bye-bye.